Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Sexy Business Podcast, Spooky Edition. As always, I am one of your hosts, Lewd Neko, and joining me is the aptly named Spooky Dangerous.
Held against my will.
And today we are doing a bit of a spooky horror Halloween themed episode where Neko gets to be very self-indulgent because I am talking about a game I love a lot known as You Kill Me Every Time Strayed, aka YKMET is how I usually pronounce the acronym. And although this will mostly be, I think, an episode where I gush a lot about a game that's pretty niche, but I have a lot of love for, I am also just going to be talking a little bit about this genre for those who have never heard of it before. And I will be talking a little bit about some of the technical aspects of this visual novel that I think make it unique and that I could see being imported into less scary genres as well. So even if you think this genre is gross and weird, you might get something out of this.
Absolutely. And I also am going to come in with a little bit of a take of a person who, look, I'm going to confess, Spooky Dangerous is a moniker that is absolutely compensating for something. I am only a little bit down with the clown. As a younger person, I think I have the opposite journey to most people, where as a younger person, I was very well adjusted and then experienced the trauma TM and then could no longer handle the horror movie content. So I've become more squeamish as I've gotten older, and I yearn for the wholesome. So I watched the VOD of Neko playing through it. I watched the first hour and a half, and there wasn't actually that much gore and violence and stuff in it, but like the whole time, I'm like, I don't think I could imagine myself in the protagonist thing because that would like just be uncomfortable in general. But still, I did get to experience a bunch of the stuff that Neko's going to talk about with some of the technical aspects, some of the insane attention to detail when it comes to the art. So I do appreciate that this is a very, very high quality game, and I'm excited for us to dig into some of that kind of stuff. So how about you kick us off, Neko? Tell us what some of the stuff worth gushing over is.
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of background on this game. So this was created by a Canadian woman who goes by Gato Bob, and she's been making visual novels for I think about a decade now. So she actually started way back on Tumblr, and basically her and someone she was working with at the time had a couple of OCs that were just serial killers, and they were like, wouldn't it be funny as a haha joke to make a dating sim? But instead of dating them, we call it a murder sim, and they try to kill you and you try to survive or die in interesting and fun ways. And so that was the original game, Boyfriend to Death and Boyfriend to Death 2. She made a couple of characters from it. So she made Strayed, Lawrence, and Renhana. So some of you may be familiar. It was pretty popular on Tumblr back in the day and is still pretty popular. And they are still available. Those ones are free. And then after that, she made a lot of art of these particular characters because they got kind of popular. This was a time when like the Tumblr Ask blog was very popular as a format. So, responding with art of, oh, what would this character do in this scenario? And eventually, over time, she built up a big following and was able to start up a Patreon. And she kind of got her first proper title, I think in 2021, which is The Price of Flesh. This is one that I've also streamed. It's very much a survival horror game. It is less in the erotic direction. This is one that I feel like I could recommend a lot easier as just a interesting little horror visual novel. Would also recommend that one. But it was very high quality, very polished. And then after that game was completed, she announced that she was basically going to be working on a project where she was going to be taking her 3 characters and making entire games for them based on their original routes, but heavily reworked. To even really say that this is a remake of Boyfriend to Death isn't accurate at all because she pretty much completely like rewrote the character, refined all of the art, changed the routing. So it's more like it takes a couple of inspiration bits from the original game, but it's very much reworked. And she did pretty much all of the work on this game. So she's responsible for the art, the writing, the coding, and even the soundtrack this time. So this is very much like a one-woman project. And very similar to Boyfriend to Death. This is still in that like murder sim or horror porn genre, where the primary appeal is not necessarily dating the character, but being forced into a terrible situation with this character, and basically seeing if you're able to survive or at least die in cool ways. So there are a lot of different choices in this game. It's very much a choice-heavy sort of game. Not in the sense that there's necessarily like a really long story. The story is actually technically only 3 days long, like 3 in-game days. But you have a lot of different ways you can take the story based off of your choices, not just determining whether or not you live or die, but even minor things like getting, special points of dialogue or specific character interactions. So, something that she did this time that I found particularly interesting is that she really wanted the player character to feel like they had a personality. Player characters in visual novels can be kind of tough to figure out. One of the things that I gripe about a lot when I'm playing dating simulators is that I hate the faceless protagonist. I find it really boring. I know that they're supposed to be self inserts, but as a result, I have no connection to the main character, and you can't really do anything with them. So I find that the interactions they have with the rest of the cast end up being very generic. And in this one, she does two things with the main character that are kind of interesting. So visually, the main character is not depicted almost ever. And you might ask how. And that's because the entire game is in POV. So every interaction you have with Strayed, you are seeing it out of your own eyes. So you kind of never need to depict the actual character's body. There are a couple of moments where, like he stabs your legs or your arms and you're going to see them. And the way that she dealt with concerns about like gender and like race and things like that is basically the player character is just like gray skinned, generic, doesn't really have a particular gender set either. And the way she deals with that in the sex scenes is that it's never said how he penetrates you exactly. It just that he does. So you can imagine in your mind what hole is being used, so to speak. So that's like one of the interesting things from a sort of physicality or art level. And then from a personality level, so the game starts off with a sort of introduction section where you meet Strayed in a bar and you have a little conversation with him. And then after he kidnaps with you, you have a couple of little interactions before essentially the game kind of starts. And in this introduction part, all of your choices determine your player's personality. So, are you going to be like really meek and shy, where you're immediately going to be like, please, I'll do whatever you say. I'm so sorry. Don't hurt me. Are you going to be the kind that's like going to try to punch him and kick him and fight back and scream and yell? Are you going to flirt with him? That is another personality. And this all changes how he interacts with you, as well as what options you have as far as your choices go. So, for example, if you start off very shy and meek, you might not even get the option down the line to try to fight back because it doesn't make sense for your character. However, there is an interesting feature of this game where the player's personality can change over the course of the 3 days. So, for example, you could start off very shy and meek and cute, and then eventually get slowly a little bit more defiant and more defiant and more violent. And he has unique interactions and unique pieces of dialogue that will react to this. And in fact, one of the hardest endings to get requires some form of personality change. And it's not determined what kind of personality change. It's just that you started off one way, and then through a couple of major decisions, you ended up in a different space. And that was really fascinating to me. It was super immersive as a player character. You kind of get to decide like what your character arc is. And it added to a lot of replayability to think about, okay, I want to try this ending again that I already got, but I want to see if this personality will do something different.
It's also interesting because, I mean, as you describe it, I'm imagining how it's coded in my head, and there probably is just some snapshots where it goes, okay, you were this personality this time, and then at the end, were you different from that or whatever. But it also makes sense in people responding to going through horrible trauma or whatever. Like someone who might have been very, very outgoing might become very, very withdrawn because of the circumstances or whatever that they've put in, which I think makes sense, and it does help lean into the realism of the situation where the main character is going through an incredibly horrible and traumatic experience, which, because you as a player are so disconnected from that, it can be difficult to kind of realize that this is possibly the worst thing that will ever happen to whoever this character was or whatever. Because I feel like a lot of the media that we consume in general does kind of distance us from a lot of these things, because we are able to be really safe and comfortable while it's playing out on the screen, while it's playing out on the computer. Like in our interview with Mal Rui, we talked a lot about how violent video games are really common and normal, and murdering other people in the game is just really a regular thing now. But sex and passion is apparently taboo and strange and weird. And I feel like this is that kind of thing where people have gotten really comfortable with sort of violent stuff, and the game's job is trying to confront you with how that changes people, but also how it like would actually feel, or like what kind of actual circumstances you would be stuck in. Because it does, I don't want to say like feels really, really realistic, but it feels like it explores a lot of the ways that this can harm a person.
Yeah, because when it comes to sort of like the girl or arrow girl genre, it's something that I've actually always been into. I got exposed to a lot of things that I shouldn't have been looking at when I was a teenager, and it probably did like radically alter my psyche. But to an extent, I do think I was just always into intense stuff, because I remember being like, no joking, 12 and being writing about like non-consensual fantasies, even though I kind of didn't understand what that meant. So like maybe some of us are just primed for that. Maybe I watched too many horror movies as a teenager. But one of the things that this does that's really interesting is I oftentimes don't like a lot of Guro games, because they really only care about the physicality of dismemberment and death and gore. Is that, you know, it's not about the psyche of the character, it's not about the story, it's not about the emotions. It's just about like, let's make some really fucked up art and force you to look at it. And it just feels cheap. It feels like watching the Saw movies, especially the later Saw movies, where there's like, you don't care anymore. It's kind of almost comedic because it's just so over the top. And so, what I enjoyed about this game, as well as The Price of Flesh, is that the actual physical gore, I would say, isn't that bad. If you are particularly squeamish, it might still bother you, but this isn't anything that's like so over the top that I think it would be like traumatizing. That being said, the writing is really where it shines, because it really gets into the player's head about like how they're feeling or what it would feel like to go through this on both like a physical and emotional level. And then the interesting thing about Strayed as like a kind of spooky horror character is Gato Bob has described him as a dark empath. So he's not a sociopath. It's not that he doesn't feel anything and that he thinks you're just basically like a meat puppet that he can do stuff with. It's that he feels incredibly empathetic towards you. It's just he doesn't want to stop those feelings. He just wants to feel them with you. So there's like some really interesting moments in the game where he starts crying when you start crying. Or like he screams at the same time that you scream. And it's such like a bizarre motivation for a character that I'd never seen before. And I think it's a really interesting take on just like the, you know, spooky guy who likes violence.
Yeah, I also
Now,
think his character design does portray him to be pretty handsome, or like the wet dog Tumblr boy made in a lab kind of vibe. And so even just from the intro, like if you didn't actually know that this was a horror game, like if you were watching the movie Tusk made by Kevin Smith and you go, oh great, a Kevin Smith movie, this is gonna be funny, I'm gonna have a great time. And then it's fucking Tusk where you see Justin Long get sewn into a walrus suit. Um, it does portray the open as like kind of casual and normal, and he is relatively, you know, conventionally attractive, and the art does a lot to kind of portray that. And if you didn't know that this was leading to you about being kidnapped, you might have thought that this was just kind of a regular dating sim visual novel.
yeah, though I will say the Gadawa does a lot to make sure people are prepared. There is like a little warning screen at the very beginning, just because I think she lists particular triggers there, so that way, even if you know you're like I'm into gore, but I have this one thing I cannot stand, you can look at the full list, you can spoil yourself, and that way you can be like more aware of what might be happening, which I think is a good thing. We've talked in the past about the experience of like I'm enjoying this porn game. Oh no, the one kink I have a hard limit about. route, and then like it kind of can soil the rest of the visual novel, or it can at least like sour your experience of it. And she did this with The Price of Flesh too, where she even spaced it out by each route. So she described the exact triggers that were in each separate route. So for example, if you were like, oh, this one route has a lot of triggers or a lot of kinks that I really do not enjoy, you could ultimately just skip that character and only focus on the other two, which I think is really smart for anyone who is considering doing a game that is engaging with horror porn or other kind of edgy, problematic, quote unquote, taboo kinks. Is I think it would be really smart to include like a list of, this is the character and here are the kinks you should expect with this character. Because that way the player feels like, they have a choice about whether or not they want to engage with that route. And if you only have one or two characters in your game and they're kind of turned off by all of those kinks, then they know to pass by that game instead of like leaving a negative review that's just like, ew, this has the thing I don't like. And then, so as far as like gameplay goes, the one other thing I did want to talk about is the endings. So a lot of times when people are going into visual novels, I've noticed especially Western players tend to have negative feelings about kinetic novels, which I disagree with. I think kinetic novels are great. For those of you who don't know, kinetic novels don't have choices. But there is sort of definitely an appeal to having a game with lots and lots of choices. You can put in achievements and secret endings and bad endings and all that fun stuff. But on the other hand, one of the problems you can run into is sometimes endings are super difficult to figure out, especially if this is a game that has a lot of different stats that you're balancing. And it's like, oh, well, first you have to make this choice in chapter 1, and you have to make this series of choices in chapter 2, and then this stat needs to be this high, but not over this number by chapter 3. And, it's very easy to get completely locked out of a particular ending or route. And sometimes they can just be written in ways that aren't super intuitive. And I think this is something Godabab was aware of when designing this game, is that it has some routes that are particularly difficult to get. Like you have to make a very specific series of choices over the course of the 3 days. The special ending that I referred to, where you have to change personality, I think took me like a couple of hours, I think collectively, to eventually get the right amount of triggers because I wanted to figure it out on my own. However, she has included a feature to make it less frustrating to the majority of people. So every time you die in-game, which is going to be quite frequently when you're achievement hunting, you get a little death token. And you can exchange these death tokens for either hints about endings or walkthroughs. And I really liked this feature. I liked the option of just getting a hint. I used those ones quite a few times because I just wanted to know if I was on the right path. Because sometimes you don't really want to be given away of the entire walkthrough, but sometimes you just want to know, like, am I being stupid about how to get this ending or not? And then I think I did use the walkthrough once or twice to help out with some of the more particular endings where I had just been like working at them for so long and I had just missed like one trigger. And I thought that was a really smart way to make achievement hunting a little bit easier because players really like collecting the endings in these kinds of games. And then the other thing she did is if you don't want to use your death tokens for any of the hints or the endings, like you figure everything out on your own, you can also exchange them for like concept art and character backgrounds. So there's still a function to the little death token thing, even if you're someone who's like, I am not interested in using walkthroughs. So I thought that was really smart. And I think it could be maybe something that lewd devs take note of, because I have known some lewd games that have gotten complaints because particular endings were very non-intuitive or were very hard to get. Especially if you're stretching out your updates over, months and months and years, it can be hard for players to backtrack and like figure out like, oh, right, what choices did I need to make with this character?
Yeah, we went for a much more simple approach with Shackles of Elswyn, where every single dialogue box is marked with a symbol that just tells you which character's route that puts you on. But that does remove some of the mystery and exploration for a person that does want to kind of grind through and figure it out for themselves. So we're kind of relying on the belief that people are going to be invested in a particular character and want to kind of follow them around like a lost puppy. And I think that that's fine. I think that does suit like Shackles really, really well. But you will always have people that are like, oh, I clicked the buttons and follow and it wasn't long enough, or, my character doesn't get enough screen time or whatever. And then having more tools in your arsenal to be able to do stuff like that. Or, for example, we've got the Bishojo Mum cosplay pictures in the game, which just slowly unlock as you explore through different areas and stuff like that. So as you reach a 100% completion, you will eventually get all the cosplay pictures, but that's just from playing through the game normally. If we instead had a token system where you could unlock the different cosplay pics as you completed different sections and stuff like that, I think that would also go over very, very well. So I think you do make a good point that it is something, and it's pretty easy to implement with Rampire, but it is something that I think that more developers should be considering, how different ways you can be building out the game to both help people play through it, but also reward them for exploring and being a completionist and achievements and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and then I think the last thing I want to talk about is all of the work that Bob has kind of done to build a brand around this specific niche, as well as marketing it. So when it comes to adult gaming in general, like obviously, like we are a very specific niche. This niche has a lot of problems with payment processors and censorship and all of the other stuff. And then if you choose a particular subset of like a kink or a fetish, you are marketing yourself to a very specific group. And so you really need to get that group on board if you want to succeed. It's already hard enough to succeed really as an indie developer at all, especially like an indie visual novel. And then it can both be potentially beneficial to make something pornographic, but also potentially problematic. Now, we've seen this sometimes in like the femboy and foodisphere, is that, you know, it is still, I think, relatively niche, at least as far as like Western visual novel developers go. So there's really only like a handful of those kinds of games. And so if you are someone who's releasing in that space, on one hand, you have a bit of a benefit here, where because it's there's so few of these kinds of games, is that people are really hungry for them. And so they will kind of, in some cases, flock towards you a little bit more because they really want that content. But on the other hand, it can be a problem where if people find issues with your content, or if you don't market it well or things like that, then you don't have sort of that more like general audience who is going to be interested in your game. And I think this is especially true for something like You Kill Me Every Time. This is, you know, obviously a pretty tough niche to market in. Anything that I think involves a lot of violence and sex is particularly fraught. As we've seen in the past with, you know, discussions about censorship, they always go after the games that are like non-consent based because, you know, you can make the claim of like, oh, anyone who plays this is evil. And in this case, You Kill Me Every Time has a really prominent fan base of actually like women. It's kind of the whole like joke about like women being super into really disturbing true crime, is that women just also seem to be really into like dark romance and horror porn. Those are both like really big genres right now. And so, because of this, and because Bob has been working in this scene for a decade, she's really done a lot of good work to make these characters very well known. And then she's continued to market the shit out of it. A lot of it is like word of mouth. I see these games get recommended a lot because they're so niche. So anytime someone is like, "What's a good game with like dark romance or yanderes for women?" I almost always see Boyfriend to Death get recommended. So she does have that as a benefit. But she's also done some really good stuff in terms of merchandising. So she's had all sorts of merchandise for like the past couple of years. So things such as acrylic keychains, pins, even like little patches, t-shirts. And then more recently, she's been working to get acrylic stands made, and even her first run of a plushie, as well as Dakimakura's very, very classic choice of merchandise. And it's really high quality art. She has a really good selection of characters. And because she has these kind of three standout characters, she has this like really dedicated fan base who wants to buy all of that stuff. So I think she's a really good example of the kinds of different merchandise you can make, even for an erotic game. You know, just because your art in game is super NSFW and things that you probably wouldn't want to put on a bag or something like that. You know, think about ways that you can make this a little bit more like safe for work, something that you could display in public and not get a ton of strange looks. Like I have a sticker of Strayed on one of my water bottles, and if people ask me about it, I'm like, oh, it's just a character from a video game. And I don't go any further than that. So I think that's a really good example of some of the things you can start to do if you are able to tackle that niche. I think there is a market for adult game merchandise that isn't really being picked up on. I've known a couple of devs who have done some small runs of like stickers and pins and things like that. But I think it's something that other devs should consider. I mean, stickers and buttons and pins are relatively low investments. You can even do like pre-orders, so that way you can only pay for the amount that you know that you're going to sell, and then, sell off any extras you have later on. I think it's something that like maybe more developers should consider, mostly because I want more. I need more waifus. I need more waifu stickers and waifu keychains to put all over my shit.
The other one is collectible cards, because THM did the big collectible cards drop. It was really successful. And also, a thing that irks me, I learned today, is that Femboy Food House also now has a collectible cards drop. So you just know that shit is going to be hella successful, and it's a really easy way to monetize the art that you have that's existing already. But I just thought of a really interesting way to help you get an idea for what kind of merch. If you watch My Dress Up Darling, if you could find something in Marion Kitagawa's room, that is a thing that a woman would want to buy. Because if you remember, the whole plot is that all the games and shit and media that she likes is like heavy doujin. Like the Shizuka-tan is like literally an eroge game. In the episode I just watched was this horror nun kind of story where like they eat each other and shit. Like that is all exactly the kind of genres that we are talking about here with You Kill Me Every Time, or with some of THM's kind of properties, and being able to make merch and stuff that fits that kind of category. Or like how many people have you seen with the fucking Ahegao hoodie with just the 100 million screenshots from Enhente? Like, it's not impossible to be able to find ways to monetize your audience, and that's kind of what it is. You're spending that time, and like Neko kind of detailed the whole journey for you, right? Gato Bob spent all this time developing the characters, making people in the community feel that connection with them, and kind of building a story around them, and having the games that do feature them. And like you said, they're free now, so you could, if you really did get into Boyfriend to Death, now you're invested in coming and having a look at You Kill Me Every Time, and building that audience, and then being able to make products that will monetize that audience because they're invested in this character, or they really like this game, or they really like the way that you've done this thing, and they're willing to support you as a person. This is kind of the main way that Patreon holds everything together, because you need people that are invested in you continuing to do work. And it is hard to grow and maintain a Patreon, but you have to be showing that what you're making has value, and you have to be showing that it is kind of built and servicing a community that maybe didn't exist without you, or is a really high quality kind of product in that kind of niche. But Neko, I did want to ask you one closing question. If you had the ability to mind control Gato Bob and put something new into a game like this, what would your number one request be for something to add?
Dental kink.
Interesting. But isn't that kind of hard because the main character isn't really perceived?
Yeah, but
And
I
also
wanted
you
to
can't
be
see
described.
into your own mouth, so I guess you would have to have Strayed hold up a mirror for you to see him doing stuff. And also he has the dentist's fucking mirror and he's doing stuff.
Listen, I just want my teeth to get ripped out, and that is not a kink I can ever do IRL, so fiction is my only option.
So true, bestie. All right, well, I think that is a great place to close. Everyone can imagine Neko getting her teeth ripped out. And while you're thinking about that, Neko, you can tell them what buttons to click.
Well, you just listened to me ramble about some absolutely insane shit for like 30 minutes. So you probably enjoyed this video, or maybe you hated it, but you should give us a like anyways, and you should subscribe and make sure that you turn on notifications, because otherwise YouTube is just going to bury all of our videos because it talks about porn and YouTube does not like that. But we don't want to censor ourselves, so we use the naughty words anyways. And if you want to, you can go ahead and leave a comment. Are you familiar with this genre? Have you played any of these games before? Were you horrified by the things that I alluded to? Tell me more. And we also appreciate suggestions. If you have a game that you've been really impressed by recently, or a game you really hated, tell us about it, and maybe we'll talk about it. And, if you know any game devs, voice actresses, artists, anybody who's working in this space, you can also let them know to reach out to either one of us, or just, give us a little shout out in the comments. We're always happy to interview more people. But otherwise, that'll be it for this spooky, scary episode of the Sexy Business Podcast. And we will see you all next time. Bye,
Bye
everybody.
bye.